those things that are the most terrible do not live in our imaginations as we, lost in the naivety of youth, stare into the dark corners of our bedrooms. Wise men know that those children are right to fear the creatures that lurk in the dark, save for one aspect of their being, that the monsters we fear are real, but are dressed in the guises of men. Joseph Schnau, a New York physician visiting Germany in 1933, learned this lesson the hard way, as it was written in his own blood on the floor of a Gestapo basement. Schnau was visited by a pair of non-uniformed men who leveled charges of unpatriotic activity at him. After a brief exchange, these Nazis kidnapped him and dragged him to an interrogation chamber somewhere in Berlin, where they beat him mercilessly. After whipping him for hours, the Gestapo men released him and he staggered home, where he lay in bed for a week before traveling to the U.S. consulate for examination. Two men, George Messersmith and Wilhelm Messerschmitt, agreed to hear his story and examine the potent physical evidence still playing on his body. Quote, "From the neck down to his heels he was a mass of raw flesh," Messersmith said. He had been beaten with whips in every possible way until his flesh was literally raw and bleeding. Both men were appalled at his condition, and mystified that he found the strength to even walk into the building so that they might see him. Messersmith continued his evaluation, eager to have evidence to bring back to his colleagues in the State Department that might support his claims that German fanaticism was swelling beyond what the federal government was willing to believe. Quote, "His buttocks were practically raw and large areas thereof still without any skin over them. The flesh had at places been practically reduced to a pulp." Messersmith had been trying to relay the gravity of the situation in Germany and convey the severity of risk that Americans took on when traveling there. Yet, his claims were so bizarre, so alien to the genteel sensibilities of Washington, that he felt as if he were talking to stones. Quote, "I wish it were really possible to make our people at home understand," he wrote to the State Department. "I feel that they should understand it. If this government remains in power, and carries on in the same measure in this direction, it will go far towards making Germany a danger to world peace for years to come. With few exceptions, the men who are running this government are of a mentality that you and I cannot understand. Some of them are psychopathic cases, and would ordinarily be receiving treatment." If Messersmith only knew how right he was. Joseph Schnau had felt, and Messersmith had now seen, the new reality of organized terror that was gripping Germany, much to the dismay of both men, and to the world at large. The worst was yet to come. This brazen display of violence against the unpatriotic occurred in June of 1933, the year of Hitler's ascent to power and the beginning of the end for millions of lives yet to be fed like chaff into the combine of the coming World War. In January of that year, Hitler's appointment was the cause célèbre of fascists and nationalists around Germany, and even in the parading celebrations that shook Berlin on the night of January 30th, the first seeds of the destruction to come began growing. Hitler's victory parade was the pride of Joseph Goebbels, who organized the procession of about 61,000 brown shirts, steel helmets, and Nazi supporters. The tide of fascism led a torchlit march around the city, which was designed to look like an infinite army of a remilitarized Germany. Goebbels set up the march such that the participants would walk a circular route, picking up fresh torches when they returned to the starting location to fulfill the propaganda minister's claim that it was a 700,000-man march. Hermann Goering certainly knew the implications, stating in a radio broadcast that, quote, "The mood could only be compared with that of August 1914, when a nation also rose up to defend everything it possessed. The shame and disgrace of the last 14 years had been wiped out." Berlin itself made the perfect location for this display, as it was viewed by the Nazis as the center of Western decay and decadence, and one of the last holdouts of the anti-Nazi sentiments in central Germany. This parade of militarism was a threat, as much as anything else, a stark reminder to the liberal-minded bohemians of urban Germany that a new age was about to begin, an age they ought to welcome with fear as the ground shook from the marching of jackboots. Even here, in this bastion of Hitler's opponents, the festivities had brought out the fanatics. One observer, Louise Solmitz, commented, quote, "It was like 1914. Everyone could have fallen into everyone else's arms in the name of Hitler. Intoxication without wine." End quote. The mood was certainly not shared by everyone, but those who disagreed knew better than to step outside on that night. It wasn't long before the Nazi Party began devouring the state, reorganizing it for its own purposes. The Reichstag voted 444 to 94 to pass the Enabling Acts in March of 1933, essentially dissolving itself as it handed the Hitler government the authority to rule by decree. Calling it a vote in any traditional sense of the word is more a formality describing what occurred than any gesture toward the spirit of democracy. The Communists, as well as a handful of Social Democrats, were not present to cast their ballot as they had already been arrested. Of those 94 Social Democrats present who voted against the measure, All did so under the watchful eye of armed SS troopers, and many would be killed for their last act of defiance. From this point forward, Hitler ruled as a dictator, and his party ran rampant with all the bloodthirsty fury of a rabid animal. In the months between the Enabling Act and the beating of Joseph Schnau, the Nazi Party set to work reorganizing the justice system to serve its ends. Holocaust historian Nicholas Wassmann writes, quote, "With Nazi activists pouring into the police force at all levels, it was impossible to draw a clear line between police repression and paramilitary violence." Upon Hermann Göring's appointment to the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, any semblance of a line between the police and the paramilitaries was gone entirely. Göring greenlit the activation of SS and brown shirt men to relieve the police of regular duties and conduct arrests themselves. In many cases, they used this opportunity to settle personal scores and get even with left-wing street fighters they'd spent the 1920s brawling with. At the end of the year, 200,000 people would be labeled as political prisoners and hauled off to quickly overflowing prisons around Germany. Along the way, the civilian court system would appease the demands of the Nazi Party by gleefully prosecuting nearly anyone sent their way. The legal system had been effectively weaponized to serve Hitler's ends. Schnau would be one of those thousands of unfortunate bystanders caught in the tumult of Hitler's seizure of government institutions, as the courts abandoned any semblance of judicial oversight and allowed random violence and kidnappings of those accused of unpatriotic activity. These crimes could be as simple as not being enthusiastic enough in your celebration of brown shirt parades that passed through the streets at all hours of the day. Through it all, Messerschmitt continued to dutifully report his findings to Washington, that the situation was deteriorating rapidly in Germany. Kidnappings of U.S. citizens by the Gestapo began as early as March of 1933, and the state's control of people's personal lives through terror was only getting worse. At the core of this rising mania was the new state program of Gleichschaltung, or self-coordination. The goal was to, quote, bring citizens, government ministries, universities, and cultural and social institutions in line with National Socialist beliefs and attitudes. Change was rapid and stark. Friends and neighbors turned on each other, reporting their peers to the Gestapo for slights both real and imagined. Roughly one-third of these reports were used to settle personal vendettas or resolve petty grievances, but regardless of the motivation behind them, the message to the public was clear: get on board with the program, or else. One German, Greta Lofer, said of the self-coordination that, quote, people whom one regarded as friends, who were known for a long time, from one hour to the next, transformed themselves, end quote. The transformation was as much for personal gain as it was for party loyalty. Anti-Nazis and Jews around Germany were getting the message that they'd best find a way out of town, and in their absence, desirable jobs and properties were left open for Aryan occupation. Art institutions, public universities, and lucrative jobs around Germany were left vacant by those fleeing the fear of being reported, and in the absence of their former occupants, those spaces were quickly overtaken by party loyalists. This created an effective feedback loop to serve the party's ends. Those most likely to be disloyal, and therefore resist, would expatriate themselves given enough pressure. With them out of the way, those with party membership could be rewarded. Bystanders still on the fence would see the clear advantage of being a good party man, and be more willing to get on board, thereby increasing the number of party members willing to report on their friends and neighbors, which would pressure more political opponents of the regime to leave. Data gathered by Eric Johnson and Karl-Heinz Ruband in their sociological work, What We Knew, shows the speed of this change in sharp relief. 471 Jewish families interviewed about their experiences in Nazi Germany reported that 69% felt that their treatment by their countrymen before 1933 was friendly or mostly friendly. However, after 1933, only 10% reported the same treatment. In the same study, these families reported staggering numbers of cases of victimization by the Nazi Party. 63% claimed they experienced taunts and threats from their peers. 22% were assaulted, 25% reported vandalism of their personal property, and 24% reported vandalization of their businesses. This data is even more staggering when the total number of Jews in Germany during the early years of Hitler's rule is considered. Jews constituted 0.75% of the total German population, and most were concentrated in few large cities. As prisons overflowed with political opponents and random victims of reporting, the Nazi government realized it needed to update its containment procedures to house an ever-growing list of dissidents. District leader Karl Kaufmann took it upon himself to reorganize the inmates under his boot heel in August of 1933. He oversaw the opening of Hamburg's first concentration camp, Kaufhof, where he was given nearly absolute authority to manage his inmates. Democratic Socialist journalist Fritz Solmitz would be one of the many victims whose life was upended by Karl Kaufmann's despotism. He was already languishing in jail for his anti-Nazi beliefs, along with 500 others who were arrested in September. Solmitz was marched from his original quarters to the yard of Cao Fu, where a new official greeted them with the promise that none would be allowed to undermine the Führer before he set his guards on them. SS troopers fell upon the inmates, kicking and punching them until the whole of them were a writhing mess on the ground. Solmitz's ordeal was far from over. He was a Jewish man, and as a Jewish democratic socialist, he was the preferred meal of SS stormtroopers. He was quickly hauled off to solitary confinement, where he was regularly beaten and whipped by the guards. Records of his suffering were kept on small slips of cigarette paper he'd smuggled into the prison, where he wrote, quote, "A very long SS man steps on my toes and yells, 'For me you'll bend over. Oi, say yes, you pig. Why don't you hang yourself? Then you won't get whipped.'" End quote. A few hours later, Solmitz was dead, one of the first victims of the rapidly expanding concentration camp system that the SS was developing to deal with the overflow of political prisoners. During the middle months of 1933, right alongside Joseph Schnau's kidnapping, the SS were expanding their concentration camp system to house thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of inmates at a time. It was Heinrich Himmler's pride and joy, the first major trophy in his cap to signal the supremacy of the, quote, protection squad over all other Nazi institutions. Yet, Himmler's pet project had only just begun, and its first real test of staying power wouldn't be on Jews or Hitler's political opponents. No, he would demonstrate the supremacy of his camps by turning them inward and purging the Nazi Party itself. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. I am always appreciative of your time. I hope you learned something from this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like, giving my account a follow, and checking out my short form content on TikTok at JohnsterTruck. I also have published a science fiction novel about pirates fighting Space Hitler. If that's something you'd be into, the link will be in the video description.